Hello and welcome to Good4Growth's presentation on promoting resilience in children, building a relational home, with me, Dr. James Duffy. Let's get started. We begin by considering the extreme to determine if we can make generalizations for the less extreme. Perhaps the most extreme might be the example of those who experienced life within a concentration camp. Elie Wiesel is a Nobel Peace Prize recipient, human rights advocate, and Holocaust survivor who wrote in his memoirs of an early experience that may indicate some of the foundations of his ability to survive the horror. He writes that when he was 8, his mother took me with her to seek the rabbi's blessing, good health for her family, success and respect for the head of the family, good husbands for her daughters, fear of God, and for her son. He continued saying that the rabbi told me to approach. He put me on his lap and asked me tenderly about my studies. I answered his easy questions as best as I could, stammering, almost incoherent. At which point the rabbi asked my mother to leave us alone. "Good," the rabbi said when she closed the door behind her. "Now we can speak calmly." We were alone a few minutes, or was it a few hours? At last he kissed me on the forehead and told me to wait outside. "Tell your mother to come back," he said. When she re-emerged from talking with him, what seemed like days later, I froze. I tried to run to her, but my legs would not obey. She was a changed woman. Violent sobs shook her body. People stared at her in commiseration. The rabbi must have said terrible things to her, terrifying, painful things about me. I must have shamed her. Years later, he wasn't able to find out what the rabbi said to his mother, and yet he was called to the side of a dying friend who said that he remembered the time when the rabbi visited the community. When Elie asked him what he remembered, the man's eyes clouded and he spoke as if a dream. "I was one of the people waiting in the antechamber to see the rabbi, but when I saw your mother crying, I left to see her home. You were walking ahead of us, and that was when she swore me to secrecy and told me what Rabbi Israel of Wishnitz, may his memory protect us, had said to her. He said, 'Sarah, know that your son will become a great man in Israel, but neither you nor I will live to see the day.' That's why I'm telling you now. And now you know why she cried." What in the experience of Elie Wiesel helps us understand some of the characteristics of resilient children, and what helps them to become resilient? Children who thrive, or at least cope with significant stress, will have at least one stable, caring, and supportive relationship with an adult. Frequently the adult is a parent, but it can also be another relative, a mentor, or even a coach. In addition, resilient children almost always have a solid grounding in a faith or cultural tradition, a sense of self-efficacy, mastery over life circumstances, and strong executive functions including emotional and behavioral self-regulation. Other common characteristics include a sense of humor, the ability to form close attachments, and what I might term an inner psychological space in which the child can retreat and feel protected. It is often, in my experience, that less secure children blame others for bad events or failures, but children who are more secure and more resilient have a sense that even if they can't control circumstances, they can control their response to the circumstances, and they have a tendency to realize some degree of growth. Another way of saying the same is to summarize that character traits associated with resilience include flexibility, an acceptance of reality, avoiding unrealistic hope, and a strong faith that life has meaning. Another Holocaust survivor, Viktor Frankl, a neurologist and later a psychiatrist, said, "We must never forget that we may also find meaning in life even when confronted with a hopeless situation, when facing a fate that cannot be changed." Let's turn to what might be called the irreducible needs of children and how these irreducible needs are concentrated to promote resilience. Two giants of the generation of my teachers included T. Barry Prazelton, the Harvard pediatrician who developed the Touchpoints program, and Stanley Greenspan, a child psychiatrist who helped us understand the inner life of autistic children and other children with special health care needs. They cooperated late in their careers to write a short book called The Irreducible Needs of Children and outline many of the same experiences that are implied by the list of characteristics of resilient children. Particularly important are ongoing nurturing relationships with an adult who provides physical protection, safety, and models for self-regulation. In addition, all children need developmentally appropriate experiences, a structure that provides limits and expectations, and a connection with a stable, supportive community, either faith-based or secular, that supports a sense of an enduring meaning in life. From the physiologic perspective, resilience can be thought of as the ability to avoid damage, either physiologic or behavioral, from exposure to chronic stress. Resilience can also be thought of as a process of adapting well in the face of adversity, or the result of using protective factors to manage many stressful circumstances without toxic effects. The same factors that promote resilience also transform toxic stress into a more tolerable or even adaptive stress. Resilience develops from both innate intrinsic factors and experiences gained in the first few years of life, primarily in the context of supportive relationships. Researchers at the Harvard Center on the Developing Child described resilience as the result of multiple interactions between environmental protective factors and highly responsive biologic systems. There is no doubt that resilience can be learned. Self-regulation and other executive functions are developed during early childhood. Non-cognitive skills such as empathy can be taught as late as adolescence. And two-generation interventions with caretakers and children can promote resilience in both. Stress may be adaptive, tolerable, or toxic. In general, stress is a good thing. It helps us grow and learn. Confronted with multiple minor challenges, we learn problem-solving, perseverance, and control of emotional responses. However, if the level of stress or the persistence of stress overwhelms our abilities to cope or to integrate our emotions, we experience toxic stress. Persistent stress response, being always on high alert, causes damage to our bodies and to our emotions, damage that may evolve into behavioral and relational disturbances as adults. Similar to what we learned about resilience, stress becomes tolerable through the effects of protective adult relationships. Mediating stress is what is referred to as the neuroendocrine immune network. The network links early life experiences to individual differences in health and functioning as adults. This slide is relatively complicated, but it shows that early life experiences, socioeconomic status, family functioning, the exposure of trauma is mediated by important relationships that buffer the effects of stress or lacks that buffering ability, and the outcome both in behavior and in neuroendocrine adjustments leads to either chronic disease or success in relationships and in profession as an adult. The biologic predispositions are important, but may be less important than relationships. The stress response described in the previous slide can be modified by both genetics and relational experiences. However, some early experience of toxic stress may have lifelong health effects, including changes in brain architecture and function, as well as lasting endocrine immune imbalance, causing the risk for cardiovascular disease, obesity, and diabetes as adults. The most important point, though, is summarized here. the most frequent commonality of children who succeed is that they have at least one stable and committed relationship with a supported parent, caregiver, or other adult. So when you ask, what can we do to promote resilience in children, we can look at ways that we can improve the relationship between young children and their caretakers. In the State of the Union address this year, President Obama stated the truth quite clearly. Each of us is here only because somebody stood up for us. So what is the nature of relational health and the quality of relationships that is referred to as attachment? John Bowlby, another in that generation of my teachers, developed attachment theory in the 40s and 50s. During the Second World War, there were many internally displaced children in Britain who were moved out of the urban areas that were being bombed into the countryside to live with either relatives or volunteers. He came to the conclusion that emotional bonds are basic for survival. Consistent with the time, he described the interactions in a cybernetic model, saying that interactive systems develop spontaneously in order to maintain proximity, ready access to the secure base of a caretaker, and also that care-seeking and care-giving are complementary. Central to the concept of attachment is that parents have working models of what's going on in the minds of their children and that they're making this intuitive connection that's reciprocal, promoting the capacity in the children to attach to the parents. The healthiest form of attachment is probably also the most common, with children who are naturally curious and naturally explore the environment while seeking their primary attachment, a secure base, when distressed. They appear self-confident, but they also are willing to ask for help. Insecure attachment patterns developed when the relationship is characterized by caregivers who are unresponsive, rejecting, or merely inconsistent. Two patterns observed in insecure attachments include internalizing and externalizing behavioral problems termed avoidant and resistant. An avoidant attachment pattern is one in which the child is passive and withdrawn and doesn't easily express distress because they have very low expectations of appropriate response when expressing distress. In older children, that might appear to be an anxious or depressed child, or might just be a child that doesn't expect to be cared for or loved. A child with a resistant pattern may appear hyperactive or even charming. However, attachments are indiscriminate, transient, and insecure. These anxious attachments develop when caregivers are unresponsive, inconsistent, or even rejecting. The most concerning and disturbed attachment pattern is one that is ambivalent, disorganized, or chaotic. There is often some sort of betrayal trauma. In other words, an adult who should be protective but who fails to protect and may actually be a perpetrator of some sort of violence or toxic stress. This maladaptive pattern often gives rise to personality disorders as adults. So, to promote resilience, we attempt to build what might be termed a relational home in which emotional pain can be held, modified, and buffered in such a way that potentially toxic stress can be transformed to tolerable or even adaptive stress in order to avoid developmental trauma. As the next slide describes, the normal sequence, the feedback loop that allows children to grow and learn, describes a pattern in which if a traumatic event occurs and the child experiences stress, the child receives support within the buffering relationship, builds internal strength, stabilizes, and learns to use the external supports present in the relational home to grow and learn from the experience, building resilience, and other executive functions that will help them become successful over the short term and also throughout the life course. Very useful to considering possible interventions to promote resilience in a relational home is the protective factors framework. With this understanding, pediatricians and policymakers consider 6 different activities that have shown to be effective. These include promoting parental resilience, improving knowledge of parenting and child development, encouraging social connections, providing concrete support in times of need, and helping to understand the importance of attachment and socio-emotional development. The Protective Factors Framework is a two-generational approach. Donald Winnicott, a British pediatrician and child psychiatrist, said sometime in the 1960s that, quote, "there is no such thing as an infant," end quote. He was revealing to us that infants are only one of a dyad, two people in a relationship, and that a child can't exist without maternal care, and that when we approach the assessment or intervention with an infant, we must include an assessment and intervention with the parent. As goes the health of the parent, so goes the health of the child. Here are some of the ways that we can promote caretaker resilience. In thinking about our own families and families in our communities, we try to identify strengths and lift up the protective factors, a process that nurtures parental self-esteem and a sense of self-efficacy. To promote compassion and empathy, we have to remember that being connected means giving help in addition to receiving help, both important for parents, older children, and teenagers. Many parents forget that they have to concentrate on self-care in order to be able to be effective as a parent. For instance, when you board an airplane, at some point the attendant will say, "In case of a cabin decompression, an oxygen mask will drop in front of you. If you're traveling with a young child, remember to put the oxygen mask on yourself before you put it on the child." So the message is to keep the child in mind often involves the abilities to self-reflect and to understand the experience of the child during a stressful experience, but it also means taking care of yourself first. Improving the knowledge of parenting and child development in caregivers is probably one of the most straightforward ideas. Sometimes parents need prompting to learn to provide a safe and stable environment. Pediatricians refer to the communication loops between children and parents as a serve and return sequence. These serve and return episodes are the ways that children learn to talk and also engage in social relationships. Parents, particularly parents who foster or assume care of children who have been exposed to trauma, sometimes need help to understand that there is a range of normal responses to stress and trauma, but there is also very predictable maladaptive responses to trauma. For instance, the anxious attachment disorders mentioned earlier are examples of relationship distortions that persist through early childhood and sometimes into adulthood. In addition, bodily symptoms such as bedwetting or chronic constipation, feeding problems, are related to the physiologic changes that are also associated with early childhood adversity. Encouraging social connections among parents in order to build a support system is absolutely important. We also encourage social connections among children in order to advance the child's ability to learn relational skills, to use imagination with play, and to identify with a community. Even more important is the child's ability to become aware of her own emotions and to identify the emotional states of others, necessary steps in emotional communication and self-regulation. Asking parents what they need is often an important question, particularly for foster parents and kinship providers. Their needs may be material, such as car seats or safe sleep equipment, but may also be emotional or spiritual. John Bowlby reflected on the relative value that European and American policies place on concrete support for parents. Man and woman power devoted to the production of material goods counts a plus in all our economic indices. Man and woman power devoted to the production of happy, healthy, and self-reliant children in their own homes does not count at all. Understanding the importance of attachment and the development of a secure base for children is described in the next slide. This graphic comes from a primary care intervention referred to as the circle of security. What is illustrated is a child that experiences a secure base and from that base is able to explore the environment and move away and experience new situations and challenges. If there is the onset of anxiety at some point during that exploration, the child can immediately return to the safe haven of the secure base. Fundamental to the circle of security is a sense in the parent of delight in the emerging capabilities of the child, and also the delight in the ability to provide that sense of security when the child needs a secure base. Finally, a relational home is one in which a person feels loved and connected, a secure base from which we venture out, and a safe haven to which we return at any age. We started out talking about the foundations of resilience, and we've emphasized some of the characteristics. Through an interplay of intrinsic and extrinsic factors, children develop the resilience to withstand and even thrive in the face of adversity, as long as they have a secure base in a relational home. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening. This has been a presentation of Good for Growth, a program brought to you by the Cardinal Health Foundation and the American Academy of Pediatrics, Ohio chapter.